Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always, I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney from theirishstory.com. Please check out our friends from radio.ie for all your radio archiving solutions. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes at irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at irishhistorypod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help us. And if you hear an episode you like, please share it on your social media. We are very grateful for all the support we receive from you, the listeners. John has set up a Patreon for the Irish History Show and the Irish Story. And if you would consider supporting the show, there is a link in the show notes. And thank you so much to everyone who's contributed already. Now, on this episode of the show, we're going to look at a very interesting and a very controversial aspect of Irish history, and that is the penal laws. So this is going to take us back to our old friends, the Williamite War and the Treaty of Limerick, which we've covered in the past. But to really talk about the penal laws, we have to go further back in history and give us some type of context of the 16th and 17th century in Ireland.
Yeah, I think you have to broaden it out even a bit further than that because, Europe as a whole was gripped by religious conflict in the 16th and 17th centuries as a result of the Protestant Reformations in various parts of the continent and, of course, the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So, starting from Martin Luther in his famous treatise against the papacy and the various Reformed churches, the Calvinist churches, and so on, springing up around Europe, you have a conflict between the idea of loyalty to the king and loyalty to the religion. Now, in pre-Reformation Europe, notwithstanding, actually, there had been persecution of heretics, like famously in the south of France, and persecution of people like Jews and Muslims in Spain and stuff. Christianity-wise, they had generally been on the same page. But the Reformation brings up a whole new question of, can you have the subject being a different religion to the king or the queen, the monarch? And according to the political theory of the time, the answer is no, of course he can't, because the monarch is there by divine right. He's there with the permission of God, if you like, to do God's work. And so the subject has a sacred right, a sacred obligation, rather, to obey the monarch. There's a series of religious wars in the early 16th century in France, and they break out several times over the course of the century. There's religious wars in Germany in the 1500s, and again in the 30 Years' War in the 1600s. The Huguenots, which is the major Protestant sect in France, are driven out of France altogether in the 1690s, so the same decade as the Jacobite Williamite War in Ireland. So it's not just an Irish thing. Now, how does it affect Ireland? The really crucial thing to understand for someone who's coming to this, for the first time, is that the intersection between two things. The Tudors decide to conquer all of Ireland for the first time. So the Tudor kings and queens of England, beginning with Henry VIII and finishing with Elizabeth I. Now, they do this in part because they have broken with the Pope in Rome. So Henry VIII wants to get married, the Pope wants to get divorced, and the Pope disagrees. So he breaks with the Pope in Rome, founds his own church. This puts him vulnerable in continental Europe. Ireland, the rest of colony, very much half conquered, is dangerous. So they want to conquer the whole thing for the first time for strategic reasons. But when they do, they have to also impose their new religion on Ireland. And so this is it's a no-brainer in 16th century terms. Of course they're going to do this, You impose uniformity on your subjects. It's what everyone does. Because how can subjects obey you if they're a different religion? They're not obliged to obey you then.
Well, John, we've talked about the 17th century in Ireland before and the Tudor conquest. And one of the points that you made, and may come as a surprise to some people, but you're originally an early modern historian, is that the the state building and getting the Catholic gentry, the Gaelic gentry on board was initially a lot more important to the state than converting the population.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is another very important point to grasp. And it's one reason why the Protestant Reformation didn't take hold. So, the way the English see it in Ireland, and there's loads of treatises about this, including Edmund Spencer, but also, there's various other ones. The Irish are an uncivilized people. Now, they are culturally inferior. They don't quite say that they're racially inferior because the idea is that you can make them into Englishmen. You can make them civilized. Is the idea. And they say that as the century progresses, there seems to be an attachment to papistry as well among the Irish. But that isn't the big problem. The big problem is they're stubbornly holding on to their ways, their culture, their language, their way of dressing, their way of holding land, etc. And once you extirpate those savage customs, everything will be all right. The civil reformation, they call it. The English thinking is that the attachment to a Catholicism is very skin deep in Gaelic Ireland, and they won't really have any problems once they basically properly conquer the place, integrate the Gaelic aristocracy with their own, so send all their kids to England to be educated. So this is very much their thinking, and then the religious reformation will follow naturally. Now that we can get into this because there's some interesting points there about 16th century Ireland, but the ones the English are actually worried about, and actually they're right to be worried about, are the Old English of Ireland themselves. So the English of Ireland, basically the medieval colonists. Now, some of them are Norman in origin, of course, many of them are, but by the 16th century, they're speaking English anyway. They identify as the Old English of Ireland. They are the ones initially who resist the Protestant Reformation more than the Gaels. There's good reason for this. The only parts of the place that the English control at the start of the Tudor conquest are the Pale and other English-speaking parts like South Wexford and Cork and Limerick and one or two other spots. And so Henry VIII seizes the monasteries and he seizes the churches for his own state church in the early 1600s. So naturally, it's in the Pale that you get the first reaction to it. However, even in the Pale, initially, the Palesmen go along with the seizure of the monasteries, for example, because lots of Palesmen get rich, they get the lands of the monasteries. But as the 16th century goes on, what you find is the stubborn attachment to Counter-Reformation Catholicism actually seems to radiate out of the Pale and English-speaking areas and then into Gaelic areas, which is surprising. And it's not the whole story either, but it's definitely seems to be a thing. So a lot of the early Catholic bishops or Catholic clerics who go off to Catholic Europe and come back as sort of like missionaries, if that's the right word, are Old English in origin, like Luke Wadding, for example, and various others. And it doesn't quite have political implications. There are Old English Catholics who join rebellions against the English crown during the 16th century, but it doesn't quite coalesce until the end of that period. Now, about the Gaels, like the story of the Tudor conquest isn't the story of the Gaels as one resisting the English, as you know, Cathal. So they're very fragmented.
Yes, and that's an interesting point that you make, that just because people are Catholic, just because the Old English or the Hiberno Normans or whatever we want to call them are Catholic, we still are in a period of great flux, and we come up to the 9 Years' War. So
Mm-hmm.
you would assume automatically that every Catholic in Ireland would join in on the side of the Gaelic Irish, Hugh O'Neill and Red Hugh O'Donnell, but that's not the case either.
No, it's not like that. I mean, so Ireland is so fragmented. Like, first of all, you have still an ethnic division. Like, you have a considerable ethnic division between people in the Pale, like I said, South Wexford, one or two other spots, those towns like Galway and Cork and Limerick, and everywhere else, which is Gaelic Irish. And that's a massive ethnic difference because it's a difference in language and culture, land holding, in everything. That said, there are Old English lords and Old English clerics and Old English merchants who do get involved in various rebellions. So, like the lords of Ballymore Eustace, for example, get hanged and they get disinherited for their role in the Desmond Rebellion in the 1580s. But in general, the Palesmen don't join Hugh O'Neill because he's their ethnic enemy, effectively, at the end of the 9 Years' War. But there's more to it as well. So in Gaelic society, it isn't a unified society. They haven't had a state since the Norman conquest, and they've got used to not having a state of any kind. The chiefdoms themselves are very disunited. People are constantly turning on each other. So the 9 Years' War, which our listeners may know, is at the 1590s, so from 1595 roughly to 1603, is a tale of constant side switching. And this is true in the religious sense as well. So we're going to just sum it up briefly here, but Irish rebels against the English crown. So the English crown is advancing and it's crushing, well, it's co-opting and it's crushing various, lords and chiefs and so on. Those who go into rebellion, like James Fitzgerald in the 1580s, Hugh O'Neill and Hugh O'Donnell in the 1590s, do declare that they are Catholic holy warriors, and they do get indulgences from the Pope, and they get support from Spain. And they're serious about this. On the other hand, people join them and then they leave again. And then they join them and then they leave again. So they may be Catholics, but they're pragmatically switching sides depending on who they think is going to win. And this is actually characteristic of like a clan-based society. So you see something like this in modern Afghanistan as well, So that's true on the religious side as well. So, for example, my supervisor way back many years ago when I was doing my master's thesis wanted me to do one about a bishop. He's a Catholic bishop, but the English want him to become a Protestant bishop. And he goes, how much are you paying or something? And they go, X. And he goes, yeah, no problem. And, briefly he goes back when it looks like Hugh O'Neill's going to win. And then he's happy enough to be a Protestant bishop again, And so you do get the side switching in the religious side as well. So there are elements of that, like the Catholic Irish identity forming. But it's an incomplete job. It's not really done even by the end of the 9 Years' War. The situation's so much more fluid. People are changing sides. They have other allegiances as well as religion. But one more thing about this. After the end of the 9 Years' War, when, as I said, the Old English of Ireland generally don't join the Gaelic rebels, there is a revolt of the Munster towns in particular, so the Old English-speaking towns, where they demand religious freedom. And they say, we were loyal during the late war, but we also want, they throw out all the royal officials and they say, we want religious toleration. And they don't get it. So, like Lord Mountjoy, who's the commander of the English forces in Ireland, comes in and he says, what the situation is that the townsmen say, by King John's charter, from back in the Middle Ages, we have religious rights. And Mountjoy says, I will cut King John his charter with King James's sword. So, in other words, I've got the swords, you shut up.
Yeah.
But the point about it is, by the 1600s, you do have something like an Irish Catholic community forming. So it is English speaking and Irish speaking. It's Old English and it's Gaelic Irish, but they're actually coalescing around the shared idea of being Catholics, which is interesting. It's a process we don't entirely understand yet.
It had never appeared before. This was a new development in Ireland.
So the previous divisions in Ireland had been ethnic, they've been linguistic and cultural. The religious thing is new. Notwithstanding, actually, there'd been different bishops in Gaelic, Irish, and English areas in the Middle Ages, but they're the same religion. It's an ethnic divide.
Well, one of the things that we should really talk about that really adds to the mix leading up to the penal laws, the period that we're talking about now, is plantations. And we have the Gaelic Irish, we have the Old English, the Normans, but then we have new groups coming into the mix.
Yeah, the New English, so-called, and then the Scots. So there's various plantations over the course of the 16th century. And interestingly, and again, it goes back to what we were saying earlier, many of the planters in like the plantation of Laois Offaly and the plantation of Munster, quite a few of them are Catholics, actually. And this does back up the idea of the English conquest of Ireland in the 16th century is not really so much a religious thing. It's state building, it's cultural, and so on. But they're not serious about the religious stuff yet, interestingly. They think
And
it'll all
even
just fall
more
into place.
bizarrely, in the Ulster plantation, we have Scots Catholics coming over to Ulster.
Yeah, so now, by the time you get to the Ulster plantation, it is a condition. You must be a Protestant to get land that has been seized from the Ulster rebels. Well, actually, from all the Ulster Gaels, because even the loyal ones get confiscated. But there are actually Scots Catholics and there are Scots Gaels, which is also against the rules because you have to be English speaking as well under the rules of the plantation. And actually, quite a few Gaelic Irish, get given land because there isn't people to take up the land. Like they're supposed to be got rid of altogether and pushed out to the margins, but they're not actually. It ends up being like the undertaker may own the land, but he has all kinds of people living on it. However, the important thing, as you just flagged there, Cathal, is by the 1600s, you have something new. You have the Protestant interest in Ireland, which are generally called the New English. Now, the Scots are Protestant by their own lights, but they're the wrong kind of Protestant. They are Presbyterians, and this is going to cause all kinds of issues going forward. But by the 1600s, you have something new, as I said, what they call the New English, or what later in the century becomes called the Protestant interest in Ireland. We're talking about the penal laws here today. So it's important, as you said, Cathal, to talk about the antecedents of the penal laws. In the 1600s, unlike the 1500s, the English state in Ireland, so the Kingdom of Ireland, is serious about religion. You must have, now that you conquered it, now that you're civilizing it, in inverted commas, you must have religious uniformity. And so there are things passed called the Recusancy Acts, which had been enforced irregularly in the 1500s. The Recusancy Acts basically say, if you don't attend the state church, you get a fine. and the fines might keep building up and it might bankrupt you. So the Catholics of Ireland are very unhappy about this. And the politics of the early 1600s in Ireland, as regards the Catholic political nation, which is the landholders and the merchants and stuff, it's a narrow band of people by comparison with the population. But the propertied Catholics, they still are in Parliament. They were gerrymandered out of majority in Parliament in 1613. But their demand is for a thing called the Graces. And the Graces is they will pay taxes. So James I and then his son Charles I having great trouble raising taxes without consent of Parliament in both kingdoms, in all three kingdoms, England, Ireland, and Scotland. The Catholics of Ireland say they'll pay taxes voluntarily if they're given religious toleration, a thing called the Graces, and they get some of what they want. At the same time, both James and Charles are doing things like confiscating more land off Catholics, and what they're doing is they're questioning their legal title. So whether they be Old English and their legal title goes back to the Middle Ages, or whether they be Gaelic Irish and their title comes from the reign of Henry VIII when they surrendered their land formally to Henry, and the problems come in succession and so on. But the point is, even at that time, they're trying to undermine the remaining Catholic landowners. Like quite a few Catholics or Gaelic landowners lost land because they were confiscated as a result of waging war in the crown. But it's still in the first half of the 1600s, about 60% of the landowners are still Catholics.
Now, it's incredible the faith that the Catholic aristocracy and the merchant class puts in the Stuarts, and particularly when we're reading back about this period in Charles I,
Yeah.
because he's married to a Catholic and he's a Stuart and he's a Gael and everything. And you're like, why? Over so many years, you wonder, why do they have any, well into the 18th century, why do they have any
Yeah.
faith in the Stuarts whatsoever?
Yeah, I mean, you can make the argument, as we'll discuss, up until 1766, the Stuarts are
Yes.
the leaders of Catholic Ireland, which, yeah, it seems very unwise. I will say in their defense, they don't have a lot of options in the 1600s. They think that their position at the top of society can be recognized in return for paying more taxes. And actually, the Stuarts are somewhat open to this. So the Stuarts have this kind of, they do have a slight sneaking regard for Catholicism, whatever with the Irish. And so there is some logic to it. But right up until the outbreak of war in the 1640s, the Civil War, Catholics of Ireland are still hoping for a deal which basically taxes for toleration. Now, the English Parliament, of course, is getting into dispute with the King over essentially it's no taxation without representation. So it's a preview of the 18th century revolutions. But there is also a religious dimension to it. The English Parliament thinks the Stuarts are way too Catholic inclined for their own good. They're not real Protestants at all. And so this leads to a showdown in the 1640s.
Well, that's it, because, like, as you mentioned there previously, we're not talking about solely two parties, a Catholic and an Anglican party. We also have the Presbyterians of Ulster and the Presbyterians of Scotland, but also Puritans, various
Mm-hmm.
different nonconformists, and they play a major role in the new model
Yeah, I mean,
army and the parliamentarian side.
yeah, I mean, Oliver Cromwell, who obviously is infamous in Ireland, is an independent, which means he's no particular sect of Protestant. All good Protestants are okay. It's just the Catholics are agents of the devil, and so on. But he's independent by religious conviction.
One of the things that, as we're talking about the 1640s, is that it's almost, in some ways, Ireland is central to it, and other ways, Ireland and disputes within Ireland and the grievances of Catholics within Ireland are thrown into a mix of issues that are happening independent of them in England and Scotland.
Absolutely. I mean, it's too big a story to just go into in this podcast, and we've done one on the
Yes.
1641, and maybe we'll return to it. We might do one on the Cromwellian period as well. But I mean, I suppose you can summarize to say that there are, in some ways, three different wars. So there's a kind of a civil war in Ireland, there's a civil war in England, and there's also a civil war in Scotland between royalists and Covenanters, between radical Presbyterians and people who were loyal to the king. And in some ways, they're different wars, and in another way, they're all connected. And essentially, the connection between them all is the Stuart monarch. So whether you are loyal to the Stuart monarch, no matter what else, and various people are loyal to him for various reasons, whether they believe in the divine right of kings, whether they believe the king can keep order in society and religion, and where, the other side practices anarchy, they believe. Or in the Irish case, because you believe the Stuarts are your only defense against people who want to annihilate you, which is what Irish Catholics come to believe in the 1640s.
Well, this is one of the things about the 1640s and into 1650s and Cromwell is that we're not talking about solely doctrinal differences and wars about transubstantiation or predestination. There is the issue of land. And then you also have the fact that when Cromwell comes over, he ascribes the rebellion not just to disenfranchisement or disputes about land, but also the nature of Catholicism itself.
Yeah, I mean, so first of all, I mean, we'll do this briefly, but the rebellion of 1641 is a combination of things. At one level, it's absolutely a response to the Ulster plantation. Like it's most fierce in Ulster, and it's absolutely about, the Gaelic Irish people of Ulster having been driven off their land. The massacres of Protestants don't only happen in Ulster, but they mostly happen in Ulster. On the other hand, the rebellion is contingent on this crisis where the Parliament of England has asserted itself against the king. It's asserted itself almost as superior to the king, and they've executed the king's minister, Wentworth. And the Parliament of England is extremely anti-Catholic. I mean, one of their grievances on the religious side is that the king is introducing Catholic-style worship in the Church of England, and they're worried that the Catholics of Ireland will be used against them. Now, of course, this adds to the febrile atmosphere in Ireland because the Irish Catholics believe that the Parliament is going to come and kill them, and they are threatening to do this. The Parliament of England, once the Civil War breaks out as well, passes a thing called the Adventurers Act, which is that Irish lands will be seized to pay for the parliamentarian army. So it becomes it's not so much a war over theology, it's a war for survival. So you have these communal groups who have coalesced. They have landed interests, as you say, Cathal. They have ethnic dimensions to them, albeit not clear-cut ones. But it's about communal survival, really. I mean, everybody thinks that they're fighting for their own survival and that of their community. And that's really, it's like a lot of conflicts are like this. They develop their own momentum. They develop a vicious spiral also of violence. But in terms of Cromwell, so Cromwell, ultimately, his faction wins the English Civil War. Now, it's a complicated process. The Parliament defeats the king. Ultimately, they can't come to an agreement with the king. So they want basically what we would call a constitutional monarchy. And Charles says, nope. He says, I'm the king. This isn't an elective kingdom. You people are rebels. I won't do any deal with you. And unfortunately for Charles, obstinacy gets him killed because they chop off his head. Now, Cromwell is at the forefront of the faction of the army, the New Model Army, the parliamentarian army, which decides to do this. They believe in what we would call a constitutional monarchy with a representative parliament of some sort. So Cromwell himself doesn't believe in universal suffrage. Some of his men do, but he manages to control that. But on the religious side, Cromwell believes in, as I said, independency, which is freedom of worship for all Protestants, but not for Catholics. Now, coming back to what you asked me, he believes Catholics are ultimately agents of the devil. So Catholics have been misled by the Antichrist. He believes, Cromwell and his cohort believe that the Pope is the Antichrist. He is in league with the devil, quite literally. And because of this, the Catholics of Ireland treacherously turned on the Protestants of Ireland and massacred them in 1641. Now, interestingly, again, it's never just about religion in Ireland. Cromwell says this shows that the Irish are an untrustworthy people because they were given civilization by the English and they didn't appreciate it. They treacherously, as I said, turned on the poor planters. Now, okay, just to move the story on, because we're here to talk about religion and the penal laws. Cromwell conquers Ireland on behalf of the English Parliament. He creates the Commonwealth. It's the first union of the three kingdoms. And he introduces independency. Independency, again, means freedom of worship for Protestants. However, in Ireland, the Catholic Church is outlawed. So there's a famous exchange in New Ross where the town is surrendering to Cromwell's forces. And they say, well, one of the things we want is freedom to practice our religion. And Cromwell famously says, I mean to mess, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, I mean to mess with the conscience of no man, but if by liberty of conscience you mean the liberty to have the mass, that will not be allowed of. Very famous quote by Oliver Cromwell. So Catholicism during the reign of Cromwell, the Commonwealth, the British Republic, if you like, is basically illegal. And there's quite a few clerics executed and banished. And things happen like Catholics are expelled from towns. They're forbidden from living in towns in the 1650s and so on. And most Catholic landowners, of course, lose all their land. So there's a very small number who pay fines instead, and they get land in Connacht, but most of them lose their land. And very few of them get it back at the Restoration when the monarchy is restored. So the Cromwell dies, his regime falls apart, the king comes back, but the Cromwellian settlement in Ireland is only very partially replaced. So there's some sort of de facto toleration of the Catholic religion to some degree, although there's still a bishop executed, in Oliver Plunkett in the so-called Popist plot of the 1680s. But the big thing is Catholics don't get their land back. either. Very few of them do. A very small number do who prove their fidelity to the monarchy.
After this period, after the Cromwellian invasion and the end of the War of the Three Kingdoms, the numbers are quite shocking. Like one of the factors is that people assume with good reason about 40% of the population is killed through warfare, starvation, famine, disease. The land situation, as you say there, is being completely transformed. Catholics form roughly 75% of the population, but their ownership of the land is in single figures probably at this stage. And
Yeah, I think if memory serves me, Cathal, it goes down to 5% or so under Cromwell, and then it goes up a little bit to about 10%, I think, under the Restoration.
but it's one of these things, as you were mentioning there with the Restoration and Charles II. This grievance about land ownership is a constant throughout the 17th century, and overturning the Cromwellian land settlement becomes one of the main issues in Irish politics in the 18th century.
Yeah, it's the only issue, really. Now, of course, famously, there's a final war, which really, copperfastens the situation. So James II comes to the throne, and he's a Catholic. He's an open Catholic. The Catholics of Ireland like this. Catholics are placed in positions of power, like Richard Talbot, the Earl of Tyrconnell. Now, mostly old English Catholics, I would note, but nevertheless, James, of course, is deposed by the Parliament of England and by William of Orange. And William of Orange is he's actually kind of the president of the Dutch Republic, but he comes in to be the King of England. Anyway, as most people in Ireland will know, there's a war between King William and King James, and the Catholics of Ireland fight for King James. Most of the Protestants of Ireland, with some exceptions actually, so there are some Protestants who believe that the loyalty to the king is more important than religion. But in any case, essentially the Catholics of Ireland fight for King James and the Protestants fight for King William, and of course forces of William, which include British but also Dutch and German and some French Huguenot troops, actually defeat the forces of King James. And this brings us on to the penal laws per se, the things that are actually known as the penal laws.
Well, before we get straight into the penal laws, we should mention the Treaty of Limerick, which brings the Williamite Wars in Ireland to a conclusion. And one of the things that I suppose looking back on it when you're reading about it in the first instance, considering everything that succeeds it, is that the Treaty of Limerick is quite lenient to the defeated Irish Catholic side.
Yeah, now the thing is, there's a good reason for this, and effectively it is that the commander of the Williamite forces is a Dutchman. So it's General Ginkel. And the Dutch actually they're the most tolerant country in Europe at the time, the Dutch Republic. So they have not overt toleration for Catholics, but they basically leave them alone. This relatively small number of Catholics who are in the Dutch Republic. In any case, Ginkel doesn't give a hat for Irish sectarian divisions. He's there to win the war for William. And for William, the war is really 90% about defending the Dutch Republic from the French. So England is in play to help the Dutch Republic. And the French troops are, of course, in Ireland on the Jacobite side, on James's side. And so in Limerick, they've defeated the Jacobite field army at the Battle of Aughrim. They're besieging the town of Limerick. And actually, the French were overthrown by Patrick Sarsfield because he wants to make peace. The French want to keep fighting on. Ginkel says this guy, Sarsfield, wants to surrender his army. Fine. Give him whatever terms he wants. So, under the terms of the Treaty of Limerick, the Jacobite army is allowed to leave the country and to go into French service. But Catholics are also guaranteed toleration of religion and that their property won't be interfered with, which is the big thing. Now, as we said, the land is the big thing. So when the Jacobites were briefly in charge in Ireland, the Catholic side, they confiscated very large numbers of Protestant estates. Now, ostensibly, this is because they're not loyal to the King James, but really, this is an overturning of the Cromwellian settlement. Now, that would never have been allowed to stand, but the existing Catholic landowners wanted guarantees from Ginkel that he would respect their property, and he did. And also, as I said, the toleration of the Catholic religion. However, this is it used to be anyway, one of the most famous moments in Irish history. The Treaty of Limerick is broken. And, everybody used to know this one fact in Irish history.
Yes, the Irish Parliament are still have their say when they see the Treaty of Limerick, and they are not impressed with the treaty.
No, now let me articulate the Protestant viewpoint, the Irish Protestant viewpoint here. So the Irish Protestant community in the 1690s has been through the wars of the 1640s, which they believed was an attempt to destroy their community. So they don't have the word genocide yet, but that's what they believe happened. It was an attempt to wipe all of them out. They got through that with God's providence. And now there was another attempt to wipe them out and to confiscate their land and so on. And what many of them say is actually, very interestingly, they kind of tend to put it in ethnic terms. So they look back through Irish history and they say the Irish are an unreliable people. They are a rebellious people. Look at all the history since the conquest. So we call it the Norman conquest, but they would say the English conquest of the 12th century is the story of Irish rebellions. And what one must do is one must put them down for good and all. So, which the Treaty of Limerick, of course, does not do because it retains a Catholic landholding interest in the country. And so, what the penal laws are actually about in the 1690s are not so much religion as disarming and disintegrating the Catholic landed interest in Ireland, which is the basis of the Catholic political community. So, the first penal law is actually about disarming Catholics in 1694. It strips away from Catholics the right to bear arms and to serve in the military. Nowadays, people don't want to serve in the military, of course, but like this means in the state of affairs that you have at that time is the laws, you have the army, which is fairly small, but the law is kept by magistrate. He raises what's kind of a posse, to enforce the law. And if you can't bear arms, it means you are subject to the people who do. And so it's very important. This is the first thing they do. Then they pass a law banishing Catholic priests. Now, this is clearly religious as well. So Catholic priests are banished from the country. But they also pass a law, and this is very significant, which is aimed at breaking up Catholic landholding. So Catholics are banned from owning property over a certain amount, and their property also has to be distributed among all their sons. So this means the Catholic holdings will become smaller and smaller, and they can't be consolidated. Now, what the Protestants of Ireland say is this is about, for good and all, making sure that we don't have to do this again. We are going to have a peaceful Protestant kingdom. And the only way to do this is to break up these rebellious people who have shown over the centuries that they are untrustworthy and rebellious and cannot be relied upon. And so this is about securing the Protestant English kingdom of Ireland. That's the way they see it.
Well, this is where we get the term the Protestant ascendancy that rises from the late 17th throughout the 18th century.
Yeah, now the term the Protestant ascendancy comes about in the 1790s. If you want to be really pedantic, Cathal, but we refer to it anyway. Going back to the term they use is in that time in the 1690s, more the Protestant interest is the term they use. But the Protestant ascendancy means, the Protestants will dominate this place. The citizens of this place will be Protestants. And when you see that in the penal laws, there's other things like Catholics can't hold public office. There's various things like there's the oath of abjuration, which means you have to deny that the Stuarts are the legitimate kings who've been ousted. But there's also the oath of supremacy, where you have to swear that the king is the head of the church as well as head of the state, which of course Catholics can't do. But there's also oaths which explicitly say that the Catholic religion is false. So the doctrine of transubstantiation, which is the water in the wine, but you have to explicitly say that this is false, which Catholics can't do, in conscience can't do. Really, when you look at the penal laws, a lot of them are like military, really, the first ones are, and they're about landholding. So they're really not religious. They're really definitely not about converting the massive Catholics in Ireland. They're about securing the security and the status of the Protestant interest.
Well, we should mention as well that while these penal laws fall harshest on the Catholic community, they also affect non-established church, non-Church of Ireland Protestants. So particularly the largest group being the Presbyterians.
Absolutely. So the Presbyterians also can't swear allegiance to the king as head of the church as well as head of the state, because they have their own church, the Kirk of Scotland, effectively, and the Presbyterian Kirk in Ireland. And there's various other things. Now, Presbyterians, to be fair, are not as discriminated against as Catholics because they're not viewed as a threat in the same way. In the wars of the 1640s, the Anglicans, as we'd call them, the term wasn't used at the time, but the Anglicans and the Presbyterians didn't really unite. They're really separate factions. In the 1690s, they do fight together. Nevertheless, Presbyterians viewed with great distrust by the establishment because the basis of what they call the revolutionary settlement, which is King William, is that the Protestant religion is established, which is the king is the head of the state as well as the church, but the king is a Protestant and he's going to respect the Protestant religion. There are also the rights of Parliament. There's a Bill of Rights, the so-called Glorious Revolution, but there's a strong religious element, which is about conformity and it's about, uniformity. It's really, again, political thing. you don't want to have dissenters because dissenters are, they can't be trusted. They're not loyal to the king.
Well, that's it. Even the words that were used at the time about Presbyterians, non-conformist, dissenter, all this type of stuff, it implies somebody that's not completely trustworthy. And there are
Yeah,
things for, a deeply religious people, such as Irish Presbyterians. Their marriages aren't recognized by the state, so their children are considered illegitimate.
yeah, and this has all issues to do with inheritance as well.
In the law, in a lot of ways, they're viewed as Protestants who aren't going to their church, which is the
Yeah,
Church of Ireland. They're like lax Church of Ireland members.
yeah. So this is the official view. Now, of course, there had been repression against Presbyterians in the 1680s in the reign of James II. That doesn't really happen. However, they are, as you say, like disadvantaged. And interestingly, I was reading today, Cathal, in preparation for our talk, Ian McBride's History of 18th Century Ireland, like rereading it. And I see an interesting factoid, which is Jonathan Swift. So he was the famous bishop in Dublin, Protestant bishop and famous satirist and writer and so on. But Swift thought the Catholics were fairly harmless by his day, which is the 1730s, but he couldn't stand the Presbyterians. And among the satires he wrote was mocking Presbyterians who came down to Dublin, country bumpkins who didn't know their way around and so on, So he viewed them as kind of, what would you say, subversives. They had all fancy ideas and they wouldn't just follow the established church like they obviously should.
Well, this is the thing. Talking about the setup of how the religions are organized is very interesting as well. Is that when you're looking at the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, it's very, very different to the Church of Ireland. It's a non-episcopal church. There's no bishops. It's very democratic. The moderator or the head of the church is like a first among equals. He's just a normal minister that takes on the role of head for a certain amount of time. It's very collegiate. Elders run the individual churches along with the minister. And that's very, very different to the Church of Ireland and also the Catholic Church. But where the
Yeah,
Church of
and there's a
Ireland is integrated into the state and it's a hierarchical organization, you have bishops, you have archbishops, and then at the top you have the king as supreme governor of the church. They would
yeah,
be looking unfavorably, not just at Presbyterians, but the organization of their church, the democratic nature of their church.
yeah, and there's other Protestant sects as well. There's Quakers and Baptists and various others, many of whom were brought over with Cromwell back at that time. But as you say, Cathal, there's a reason why Irish republicanism was founded by Ulster Presbyterians, which is that they do have this tradition of free thinking and of nonconformity and of kind of horizontal as opposed to vertical organization. And also, one other thing to say in terms of demographics is that the Presbyterian population actually really rose after the 1690s because there was a big influx of immigration from Scotland. We all know that the Ulster plantation planted various Scottish communities in Ulster, but Presbyterians only became the majority in Ulster as a result of essentially immigration in the 1690s. There's a famine in Scotland, things are better in Ulster. However, and this kind of does show the difference, I think, between the status of Presbyterians and Catholics in 18th century Ireland. Presbyterians are also interested in coming to Ireland because there's all this land that's available now for Protestants because Catholics are being disinherited. So Presbyterians are a step above Catholics, even though they're not really trusted by the establishment.
Well, if we look at the Irish Parliament now, who pass all these penal laws, in the early 1700s, the Irish Parliament, it's modelled on Westminster. You have the King at the top, you have an Irish House of Lords, and then an Irish House of Commons. Only members of the Church of Ireland can sit in the House of Commons, and the franchise is limited to around 4% of the population because of different income and property bars as well.
And religion, yeah.
So it's a very, very limited electorate for the Irish House of Commons.
Sure. And we had what I thought was a very interesting series on the Irish Parliament and Irish elections, actually, called in the 1700s. But
Yes.
yeah, no, absolutely it is. So it is the Protestant interest, what becomes known in the end of the century as the Protestant ascendancy. It's a narrow kind of Anglican elite. Now, one of the interesting things I think sociologically about this is the city of Dublin, where of course all this is based, and they built from the 1740s, the Grand Parliament building, which is on College Green, and it's the Bank of Ireland today. But Dublin is actually majority Protestant from most of the 18th century up until quite late in the century. And these would have been mostly conforming Protestants. They would have been mostly members of the established church. And so I think one of the interesting things about the Irish Parliament, because they talk about themselves, they begin to talk about themselves as the Irish nation, and various people among them, including William Molyneux, Henry Grattan, and various others, talk about representing the Irish nation as opposed to England. I think this is possible because you're living in Dublin in a kind of a bubble where Protestants are the majority, and you can kid yourself into thinking that you really do represent the Irish nation.
Yes, absolutely. And even with that growth of the Patriot Party and the growth of, for want of a better word, nationalism, Irish nationalism, it doesn't
Mm.
equate to viewing Catholics as equal or looking to grant Catholics to vote.
Well, eventually it does, but I've been thinking a lot about this recently, Cathal. I recently had a review on the site of James Quinn's new history of 1798 rebellion, and it occurs to me, I'm going to say this in a very simplified and vulgar way, that the 1790s and the 1780s and Irish patriots and the early Irish Republicans, who are, of course, mostly Protestant, is about the complacency of the Protestant elite or part of it. You know, they feel that they're no longer under threat from Catholics. And we get onto that in a second about the Catholic side of the story. They feel that it's a new age. Some of them believe, with the American Revolution and the French Revolution, it's fine to give concessions to Catholics because you're secure in your position. You're still going to be the head of society. Catholics aren't a threat anymore. And anyway, this is very interesting. Even many radicals in the United Irishmen believe that Catholicism is fading away. So they're very encouraged by the French Revolution and its separation of church and state. And they think that Catholicism, which was a tyrannical religion and was against liberty, is fading away anyway. So you don't need to be worried about it anymore. Now, like one of the very interesting things, which I don't think that we've really, and I say we, the collective, we have really understood, is that the 1790s is in large part about this kind of elite defection, like part of the elite switches sides. People like Lord Edward Fitzgerald, who was one of the highest aristocrats in Ireland, becomes a Republican rebel, dies as a Republican rebel. Like it's something that's fascinating. But I think that this is what gives the 1790s its character, this kind of complacency among the Protestant elite. And you notice many of them swing back, or their descendants in the early 19th century swing back again to like conservatism once they realize this is really a challenge to their position. The Catholics are not going away. But like, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, as a Republican, believes in universal suffrage. He goes around his estate in County Kildare, eating with the peasants on the estate, but he marries also the daughter of one of the princes of France, Philippe d'Orléans, who himself goes on the exact same journey. He calls himself Philippe Egalité. So it's a thing in 1790s Europe as well, where it's this, what we would call nowadays elite defection. We're part of the elite splits off, and that's why you have revolutions. But we digress, Cathal.
Yes.
I want to talk a bit about the
And
penal
not
laws
just
again.
in the 1790s, should we say, like, as we
Oh,
think
I think
about the
this is
sisters of Lord French and the Earl of Middleton.
This is an excellent point, and let's just talk about that for a second. It's way off our topic tonight, Cathal,
Yeah.
but I think it's interesting. Yeah, even in the 1920s, in that revolutionary period, where it's quite different in some ways because the Republican movement is led mostly by lower middle class kind of Irish Catholics. However, you do get elite defection as well, particularly by women, as you say.
Yes.
So I mean, you
Well, I
have
should say, I
Charlotte
should
Des.
name them and not just talk about them as the sisters of Scobnett ní
Yeah,
Brúther and Charlotte Despard.
yeah. So Gobnett, whatever, is the sister of the Earl of Middleton, who is the leader of Irish Southern Unionism.
Yes.
And Charlotte Despard is the sister of Sir John French, who was the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the military governor, basically. A topic for another day. But I mean, also, part of the story, even at that time, is to a degree elite defection as well, although not as decisively, I would say, in the 1790s. But Erskine Childers, Roger Casement, people like that, it is a factor as
Mm.
well. So I mean, sectarianism never entirely explains what happens in Ireland, although it's all sadly inescapable as well. But I want to talk, Colin, about the Catholic side of the equation in the 1700s and how the penal laws affected Catholics.
Yes, and we've covered an awful lot of the penal laws. You've mentioned them already, but there are other penal laws we haven't mentioned. There's how it affects education, that strictly speaking, it's against the law to teach Catholic children, to be a teacher. Trinity College Dublin is off limits. The University of Dublin is off limits to Catholics, and that's continues on until 1793. And it's why as well that we see so many of the few remaining elite Catholics of gentry or mercantile backgrounds being educated on the continent rather than
Oh yeah.
being educated in Ireland. We didn't mention there about the Catholic couldn't own a horse worth more than £5. Now, as you said, mentioned there already, with regards to militias and having the right to bear arms, there's also the issue of cavalry officers, which is a lot more important in the 18th century than it is now. But owning a very high quality horse also has an implication for if there's a rebellion.
Exactly. And just to illustrate this, I'm going to tell a very famous story from the 1770s, which is the story of a man called Arthur Leary. Arthur Leary was from, one could say, part of the surviving Catholic gentry. Like Sean Connolly, the 18th century historian, has very interesting articles about how part of the Catholic gentry survived in a status by being the chief tenant on the estate, even though their family had long lost the estate to a Protestant landlord. Anyway, as you mentioned, Cathal, Catholics couldn't bear arms and they couldn't study, and they clearly couldn't study for their religion. So what remained of the Catholic gentry, plus people who had made money in business, so like exporting butter in Cork is the famous thing, their sons would go abroad to Catholic Europe. So they would go to the Irish colleges, which are established in the 16th century. They would study there. Daniel O'Connell famously studies law in Paris. They would serve in the military. So they would also recruit people to serve in the military because, again, Catholics couldn't serve in the British Army until the 1790s. Arthur Leary, who was from near Macroom in Cork, serves in the Austrian Habsburg Army. I had thought that he served in the French Army, but turns out it was the Austrian Army. Comes back splendid in his uniform and riding fine cavalry horse. And actually, what he's doing back in Ireland is he's recruiting, which is sometimes allowed and sometimes not, depending on the relationship of England with France or Spain or Austria at the time. And particularly the French, of course, they're often at war with them, but sometimes they're not. Anyway, Arthur Leary rides into Macroom and he meets there the Protestant magistrate, Morris. And Morris says to him, that horse is worth more than £5, and Catholics aren't allowed to ride a horse of more than £5. And there's a scuffle, and O'Leary actually challenges him to a duel, which Morris declines. But Morris is the magistrate, so he gets O'Leary declared an outlaw. The militia goes and they shoot him down. Now, actually, some of O'Leary's kind of followers later on shoot Morris in Cork City and fatally wound him. So there's revenge. There's a famous poem about this by his widow, Queen Arthur O'Leary. His widow was actually an aunt of Daniel O'Connell. Now, the point is, though, that this shows the balance of power. I mean, it shows it is imposed like by violence, and it's not like the penal laws are not an abstract thing. They determine who has the power on the ground. Like this is probably an exceptional example, but that's one example. There's also, this used to be again very famous in Irish history, as we've got less religious rather, people don't care about it so much. But there is such a thing as a priest hunter, whose job is to go around the country and to catch Catholic priests, and some of whom are executed. And there is even a law passed in 1719 where Catholic priests are to be castrated if they are found. Now, it isn't often used. I'm not sure if it's ever used. Sometimes criminals are castrated before they're hanged at the time. It's a more brutal age. But whereas, the majority of Catholics wouldn't, of course, been able to hold public office or vote or whatever anyway, because that's the preserve of a narrow kind of economic elite. It does matter. The penal laws do matter. They are about imposing control and imposing the hierarchy of society, which is the Protestant ascendancy. The Protestants are in charge in all of Ireland, throughout the 18th century.
Yes, and as you mentioned there, the severity with which the penal laws are imposed really depends on the local magistrate. So some can be quite liberal, some can be very rigorous in their enforcement of these laws. But also, as you say there, despite the fact that 75% of the population is Catholic, it's really apparent from the lowest peasants up to the gentry that you were a second-class citizen, that there are
Yeah,
levels of society which you are excluded from.
100%. So the fine stone church in the town will be a Protestant church, depending on the international climate. So it very much depends on whether Jacobitism appears to be dangerous and whether England is at war with France and so on. But depending on the situation, the priests can be arrested. And so Mass is generally said in Mass houses, but it can be also said famously in Mass rocks. So this is, again, a famous trope, but it is true. And just for a very local reference here, Cathal, so I'm sitting here at Farnham in Dublin, and in the 18th century, opposite where the Catholic Church is today, which is opposite the Yellow House, there was a Mass house, but there was also a Mass rock up in the mountains in a place called Ballinascorny. Now, it was actually recreated in the 19th century as kind of a memorial. But it's, a very remote spot. It's on the way to Kilbride Army Barracks. And there are these things all over the country. So at times where the political temperature is high, where they're worried about a Jacobite rebellion or a Jacobite invasion or French invasion. So it's such as during the Scottish Jacobite rebellions in 1715, 1745, there is repression. You are a second class citizen. You can be hunted, you know, by the local militia and so on for going to mass. And the priest can be arrested and can be killed. You know, generally this doesn't happen. Like generally, actually, priests are registered and they know who they are, and there's even bishops filter back into Ireland over the course of the 1700s. But the point is, it can happen. It does show who's the boss and who is the first class, as you said, and the second class citizen.
And usually anything to do with practicing your religion, it may be tolerated as long as it's done very privately, doesn't attract much attention.
Yeah, we're going to get on to how it's you know, how the penal laws are gradually repealed. But like, I know you know the story, Cathal, of the Smock Alley Catholic Church, but it does show that even once they do allow the Catholic Church to revive in Ireland, it's very much for a period of do it quietly. Maybe you'd like to tell that story.
Yes, I found that very fascinating when I was going through Temple Bar and when we were both tour guiding in the past. But one of the stops on the tour was Smock Alley, and it's beautiful, very old theatre dating back to 1662. It used to be a one-stage theatre royal, but in the early 19th century, it became a Catholic church, the Church of Saints Michael and John, well into the late 20th century. But one of the things that made it famous in its early years was that the parish priest, Father Blake, had secretly had a bell installed, and in an act of utter impertinence, had rang the bell for mass. And he was prosecuted by the city fathers, by the corporation, and defended by Daniel O'Connell at trial. But this idea that we'll allow you to have a church as long as it's down a back lane, as long as it's not too open, and as long as you're not drawing your attention to yourself by ringing a bell. That's that's too uppity to be doing that.
Yeah.
But you know, it's as you say there, if you go around towns across Ireland, that the Church of Ireland church is usually the big church in the centre of town, and the Catholic Church is usually the newer church on the outskirts of town. Because we see this church building really take hold in the late 19th century in Ireland.
Yeah, although again, I'd like to tell another Dublin anecdote though, if I may. Just two streets over from where we're talking about, Smock Alley is in the western part of Temple Bar. Just the other side of Christchurch, you have Cook Street. And Cook Street has two interesting places. So it has a Franciscan chapel that was seized by Henry VIII in the early Reformation. And there was rioting there among Dubliners, Catholic and Protestant Dubliners in the 1620s, as to who should actually be able to say their service there. Now, of course, the Protestants went out in that one, but today it is again a Franciscan friary, I believe, based on Merchant's Quay. But just over that, you have a bit of the city wall, and then you have St. Auden's Church, which is, as far as I know, the oldest extant church in Dublin. I was actually in it the other day, and it's a fascinating church. There's medieval tombs there and so on. But St. Auden's Church, again, was seized for the established religion. And when the Catholic Church, though, was allowed to open churches again, and as you said, Colin, in the early 1800s, they had to be somewhat circumspect about this because the penal laws are only just repealed. But in the late 1800s, there is a boom in Catholic church building, and the Catholic Church, in a great act of triumphalism, builds a church that is twice as big or three times as big right up against the walls of St. Auden's. Now, just to kind of close that anecdote out, today, interestingly, that church is used by the Polish community in Dublin. So showing the evolution, I suppose, of the city's history. But I suppose we should get on to the period from the 1770s onwards where the penal laws begin to be repealed.
Yes, we have these Catholic Relief Acts, but they don't appear out of thin air. Like we do have a movement originally started by the most elite Catholics, gentry or former gentry in Ireland, pushing for relief for Catholics and repeal of these penal laws. But at the same time, we have developments in Ireland, in Britain, internationally, throughout Europe, that make the British government think that perhaps it is time to loosen these laws.
Yeah, now actually, it occurred to me I should say one more thing about the penal laws themselves before we move on to this, but it is connected with what you're saying, Carl, about international events. So the Protestant version of the penal laws is whether, you know, they are enforced or not, the penal laws are there for the security of the state because you have this great bunch of people who are not only not loyal to the king as head of the church, but they're also loyal to another king, which is the Stuart king. And there's something to this. So recently, people, well, relatively recently, like in the last 25 years, people like Eamon O'Ciara have looked at the Irish language poetry of the 1700s and the 1600s and 1700s, and they have found that there is actually a very deep attachment among Irish Catholics to the exiled Stuarts. And the Aisling poem is the most famous genre. So it's in a dream, a beautiful woman appears and will rescue Ireland, and it's Ireland and it's crying out for a savior. And who is the savior? It's the Stuart king across the water. Now, as you said, this most unrequited love, but
Yes.
nevertheless, but it does appear to be genuine. So, like especially in Irish-speaking Ireland, but not only, Irish Catholics do hope for a revolution of sorts in Ireland, where the Stuarts are restored and where the landholding settlement of the Williamite Wars is torn up, where the Catholics become again the boss of society. It's a form of nationalism, really, although it doesn't have that name. Now, the Protestant version is this is why the penal laws are there. They're there for the security of the state, and there's something to it. But this various Jacobite attempts to restore the monarchy, principally in Scotland, are of course defeated. And in 1766, the last living son of James II dies, and the Catholic Church itself gives up the ghost. They say they are no longer recognizing the Stuart kings as the rightful kings of the three kingdoms. Catholics in Ireland officially give up support, though they wouldn't have overtly supported the Stuarts, but they formally renounce the Stuarts from that date onwards, 1766. So one of the big reasons behind the penal laws has been taken away.
So we have this body called the Catholic Committee. And originally, as I mentioned there, it's people like Lord Kenmare, it's the bishops, it's a very conservative body who are really going cap in hand to the Crown, to the Irish government and the British government to ask for relief, to basically say we're not a threat anymore. And we just want religious toleration. We want to enjoy the same rights as other subjects within the kingdom. And then you
Yeah.
see over time, this body becomes larger, it becomes more democratic, and it becomes more radical in its requests.
Yeah, now there's a number of things happening, I think. I mean, it occurs to me that in any regime where minority is keeping down the majority, eventually they have to let up because it's keeping back the progress, to use a very old-fashioned term, of
Yeah.
the society. Now, I wouldn't directly equate penal law Ireland with apartheid South Africa. They're not quite the same because you can convert religion and some people do, whereas you can't convert race. However, there are some similarities in that, like, you are upholding the rule of a minority, you're keeping down the majority, and you can only do this for so long, and it begins to interfere kind of with your society. So the first thing that they let up are the religious toleration, because as you said, the Catholic Church no longer backs a rival king, but they also, one of the first things that they fix or that they repeal is the very stringent restrictions on Catholic landholding. So Catholics are allowed to, first of all, I mean, Catholics were limited to a 30-year lease, and now it can be a 999-year lease. And this makes it liberates, if you like, Catholic farmers to become big farmers, to begin consolidating land again. And lots of them do. Kevin Whelan has a very interesting article on this about the rise of the Catholic rural middle class. They stop the thing where Catholics have to divide up all their land. So again, you can consolidate your land, and this, of course, it has economic benefits. So from the 1770s onwards, you can a Catholic middle class can consolidate itself, can pay tax, and so on. I think that's part of it. But of course, what intervenes is the era of revolution. So you have revolution in America, and then you have revolution in France, and in Ireland you have a kind of revolution, the revolution of 1782, which is this what we referred to before, this kind of colonial nationalism, where the Irish Parliament asserts itself against the British government, says we want, legislative independence. We want the right to pass laws without reference to the Parliament of England, which they somewhat get. They want also
Yes.
free trade between Ireland and England and so on. But the point is that the Patriots also, most of the Patriots also wanted to broaden the base of society by reforming the electoral system and by giving political rights back to Catholics. Not all of them do, but a significant amount of them do, including Henry Grattan, who's the unofficial leader of the Patriot movement of the 1780s.
Yes, that's the point that by the 1780s, that sort of patriot movement has won over the majority of their MPs to the idea of maybe Catholic emancipation is the wrong word, but expanding Catholic rights.
Yeah, so the first thing is like, I mean, there's not that much pushback against allowing the religious toleration, basically allowing the Catholic Church to operate again. Like the British government even pays for a college at Maynooth for the Catholic Church in the 1790s. And then there's the landholding restrictions are given up and the thing about the horse and so on. They also eventually relent about the bearing arms thing because they want lots of Irish Catholics to join the British Army for the Napoleonic Wars, which they do. But that's a bit down the line. Now, the thing is, though, among this, we've touched on this already, Cathal, but among the Protestant elite, lots of them are very interested in these new ideas. They believe in progress. They believe in enlightenment, the age of reason. Catholicism will fade away anyway. We are good, enlightened people. We believe in reason. We believe in, not quite democracy, but representative government. And so a part of the elite, and not just the real radicals in the United Irishmen, but a part of the elite believes in this. They want to bring Catholics in on some terms. This coincides with Presbyterians, as who else you've spoken about, are also excluded from political power. And Catholics, as you've spoken about in the Catholic Committee, also demanding political rights. And it's this fusion that creates, the United Irishmen. So a bit of the elite defects. You've the Presbyterians, you've got the Catholics. And actually, like what creates the United Irishmen in the first place, Carl, as you well know, is the fusion of the demand for the Catholic Committee, of which Wolfe Tone was a member,
Yeah.
for Catholic rights, and the radical demand for essentially universal male suffrage in reasonably apportioned constituencies. So it's a fusion of things demanding rights for Catholics. Part of the elite is won over, but it's also very important in Irish history that part of the elite is not. Part of the elite digs in its heels. So particularly what's known as the junta, who are effectively the cabinet. They're the leading members of Parliament, Foster, Fitzgibbon, and Beresford, appointed basically by Dublin Castle, and they say no. After the 1780s, and certainly by the 1790s, when you've at war with revolutionary France, this is far enough. The Catholics were given the vote in 1793, but that is absolutely as far as they will go. Catholics cannot be given the right to hold public office because they are disloyal. Whether they were disloyal to the Stuarts, now they might be, loyal to a French invasion of a different kind. They cannot go further. The radicals, of course, tried to go the whole way. They want the Irish Republic model on France and the 1798 rebellion. And the rebellion fails. As regards the penal laws, lots of the stuff has been abolished by now. Catholics have the right to vote in 1793. They have the right to study in Trinity College. They have the right to serve in the British Army, although they still have to take an oath at that point, during Catholicism. One or two of them do, to be an officer now. But the thing is, in the aftermath of the rebellion, the hope of the British government wants the Act of Union, of course. They figured that the place has become ungovernable. They want to join it with Britain. But the offer really of Cornwallis is that Catholic emancipation. So the full integration of Catholics as citizens will happen as a result of the Union. And the thing is, it doesn't happen. So it's one of the very decisive moments in Irish history.
Well, the big argument for the Act of Union is that while Catholics form a large majority in Ireland, if you create this new polity, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, Catholics will be a small minority. So it's far safer to extend Catholic emancipation at that point to grant the right to vote, grant the right to sit in Parliament. They're no threat to the state at that point in the way that they would be if Ireland was an independent kingdom with its own Parliament.
Absolutely. And this is the argument. And we may ponder, and many people have pondered, what would have happened had the Act of Union been accompanied by Catholic emancipation. Because, interestingly, the Catholic Church itself backed the Act of Union, whereas the Orange Order was vehemently against it. So things you might
Yes.
surprise people to know.
Well, isn't
But of
that
course,
one of
that's not
the
what happened.
yeah, isn't that one of the points that the Hanoverian king, George III, that he
Yeah,
actually took his coronation oath so seriously that to be a defender of the Protestant faith, that said he couldn't in good conscience grant Catholic emancipation.
that's correct. So the king basically vetoed Catholic emancipation. Now, I think it's also the case that the Protestant elite in Ireland had a say too, so they managed to get the Act of Union over the line by various means, including
Yes,
bribery.
fair and
But
foul.
fair and foul. Patrick Gagan actually has interesting work on this, where he's discovered it's the biggest single bribe in British history. But we
Yes.
digress. The Protestant elite in Ireland isn't ready for Catholic emancipation. Let's put it that way. In 1800, they feel they've just put down this rebellion, which they believe is some deluded Protestants who were infected with this Jacobin nonsense and a load of papists who were trying to do 1641 again, is what many of them believe. rightly or wrongly.
Yeah.
They're not ready for emancipation either. But it's, if you were a unionist, which I think it's fair to say that we're not called, but if you were a unionist, not without religious affiliations, it is the massive missed opportunity to include Catholics in the union, because maybe, just maybe, Catholics would have been firm unionists in the 19th century had they received Catholic emancipation, full citizenship, along with the union.
Well, as we mentioned there earlier, a lot of this is about Protestants misinterpreting Catholics and Catholic motivation. So, as you said there earlier about like radical Republican Protestants viewing the mass of the Catholic Irish population as fertile seeds, fertile ground for republicanism,
A blank slate
democracy,
almost, huh?
blank slate, and once they're shown the once they're allowed to exercise their rights as full citizens, they'll turn their backs on the superstition and the hierarchical nature of Catholicism, and this will just happen naturally. And from the other perspective, you have the very, very ultra conservative, the likes of the Beresfords and Dublin Castle, who say that Catholics will never be fully assimilated into public society in Ireland. That all this talk of, loyalty to the crown, and they'll never assimilate properly.
Absolutely. And the funny thing is that actually, like, the Catholic masses, if you like, assimilate the ideas of the late 18th century on their own terms. So you see, in the Irish language poetry, again, people have done interesting studies in the early 19th century now, and you see a strange fusion of Catholicism and republicanism, and again, a type of nationalism. And the nationalism involved is, we are the true people of Ireland, we are the natives of the country. The foreign English interlopers, the heretics, will someday be ousted, and we will plant the tree of liberty. So you see, it's a number of contradictory ideas, but like, they absorb them on their own terms. Now, there's different patterns around the country. So the east of the country is much more politicized than the west, for example. I always think that you're right. I think it's a kind of a patronizing attitude that both Protestant liberals and Protestant conservatives in the 1790s have. So the liberals, as you said, think this is a blank slate on which the age of reason will fall. And the conservatives think, well, they're just papists, barbarians anyway. And just as the people of the 1690s said they cannot be trusted and they will turn on you at any
Mhm.
chance, and neither of them are really willing to accept the Catholics on their own terms.
While we get into the early 19th century, after the Act of Union has been passed and we have one single unified parliament for all three kingdoms, the Imperial Parliament in Westminster and London, this running sore still hasn't been addressed of Catholics having the right to sit in Parliament, which leads to what is sometimes described as the first mass democratic movement in Europe.
Daniel O'Connell, yeah. The more I read about Daniel O'Connell, Carl, the more fascinated I get. I don't necessarily admire everything that I find out. O'Connell represents, in many ways, the contradictions of politicized Catholic Ireland. So O'Connell's famously part of the remnants of the Catholic gentry, which survived the penal law era. He studies in France. He's a witness of the French Revolution, and he's actually, in some ways, he is also a product of the Age of Reason. And one of the things you see about O'Connell, Cahill, is he talks about liberty. He talks about the rights of man. He talks about Catholic Protestant and dissenter. Actually, he uses a lot of the United Irish rhetoric. Effectively, he says the Catholics were duped in by these, people playing at revolution in 1790s into this stupid rebellion. So Cahill, he's completely against the 1798 rebellion and so on. And he does things like, he says, I'm completely loyal to His Majesty and Her Majesty, depending on the time, and so and the Constitution and so on. But we nevertheless want the Irish nation to live again. So it's full of contradictions, O'Connell. But so are the Catholic people of
Yes.
Ireland. So O'Connell. I'm less and less convinced by the idea that O'Connell, like Kevin Whelan argued, for example, that O'Connell undid the good work of the United Irishmen in creating secular republicanism. No, O'Connell embodies the contradictions of the Catholic people, be they class contradictions, be they the contradiction between the idea of liberty and the idea of the sectarian idea, effectively, which is very much alive as well. But O'Connell organizes them in the Catholic Association, where it's almost like a modern political party. You pay your dues, he has mass rallies, he has newspapers. As you said, it's in some ways proto-democratic party that he mobilizes. And of course, what happens, the way he gets emancipation in the end, which is the right for Catholics to hold public office, is he gets himself elected, because Catholics can vote but not sit in Parliament. He gets himself elected for County Clare. And people talk about the discipline of the election. So there's no drinking, no violence. People orderly come to vote. And people, the fear at the time is people will be afraid of the landlord. And the landlord's, of course, 90%, 90+% Protestant. And they defy the landlords to vote for O'Connell. Whereupon the Duke of Wellington, accedes to Catholic emancipation. He's the Prime Minister by that point in 1829.
That's really is very interesting when you talk about like the contradictions associated with O'Connell, because even today, if his name comes up on Twitter or anything like that, you'll get so many different opinions of him. And the man who said, like, Irish freedom isn't worth a drop of blood, who abjures all violence, is able to build this huge political movement and have these meetings where regularly getting 100,000 people and more at these meetings. But the implication in the background being, and this is the implication that the British government take, is that we can't continue to defy and ignore a movement where one man can call a meeting and get 100,000 people at it. Like, what could
Absolutely.
possibly happen? And then there is also the idea that practically every large town in Ireland has an O'Connell Street. The main street in Dublin is O'Connell Street with a huge statue of him. And at the same time, like, you have among radical Republicans and more left-wing elements in Ireland, the idea that he's the man that sold out the 40 shilling freeholders, that he only spoke for the Catholic elite rather than all the Catholic people. But that certainly doesn't seem to be the way he was remembered at the time, apart from what would be called the most advanced nationalists, the Young Irelanders and people like that.
Yeah, now just to bring listeners up to speed here on what we're talking about. So O'Connell is a politician down to his fingertips. He is all about doing deals and getting the results that he needs now, rather than, a very coherent ideological platform. That's not O'Connell at all. So when emancipation comes about, the British government obviously, and what you can still call, I think, the ruling class in Ireland, which is the Protestant landed gentry and also to some degree the business community, they think, here's the problem. If Catholics, even 40 shilling freeholders, so not everybody, but if the mass of Catholics will be the majority of voters and they can vote for Catholics, we will be removed from positions of power in the country.
Hmm.
And so the quid pro quo for emancipation is that the property qualification is drastically raised. It's raised to £10. And so in the short term, the Protestants managed to keep political control because they're still the majority of property holders. Now, O'Connell O'Connell adopts a lot of the rhetoric of the 1790s of the United Irishmen. He says, I want universal male suffrage and I want annual parliaments, which is a demand since abandoned. Can you imagine an election every year, Carl? I wouldn't fancy it.
Yes, no.
But O'Connell is actually a fusion of various things. He's not never just one thing or the other. But O'Connell says, okay, we'll put that in the bank. The property qualification will come down in the future. But the important thing is to get emancipation over the line. So judge that as you will. O'Connell, it is true, does not have a program for social reform. So at that point, the population of Ireland is skyrocketing. Most of them are very poor. And it ends eventually with the catastrophe of the Great Famine. Now, that's out of our brief today, so we might leave that aside. But also, I mean, it's not just emancipation of 1829. So O'Connell, and in his alliance with the Whigs, and the Whigs are in power in England in most of the 1830s, he's very close to a senior British official, Thomas Drummond, who nobody knows who he is today in Ireland, but his statue stands in Dublin City Hall. And Drummond effectively advances a lot of O'Connell's agenda. So he reforms the municipalities of Ireland so Catholics have the right to vote there. He bans the Orange Order for a while. The other great grievance of Catholic Ireland at the time is the tithe. So Catholics have to pay for the established church, even though they're not members. Drummond puts a stop to that. Drummond also tries to stop landlords from evicting their tenants as well. And so on his statue in Dublin City Hall, it says property has its duties as well as its rights. Completely forgotten figure, but actually very important. So he's basically a kind of O'Connellite, British official in Dublin Castle until his death in 1840. O'Connell, I believe, actually commissioned the statue, which stands in City Hall today.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And another person who gets a good mention on the tours going through Dublin when you reach
Yeah,
City Hall.
I always like to mention Thomas Drummond because he's a mostly forgotten figure. Now, I suppose we should wrap up though with talking about the actual Catholic Church itself. So, the Catholic Church becomes tremendously powerful in the 19th century in Ireland, Cathal, I would say.
Yes, but like as you mentioned there earlier about the founding of Maynooth in 1795, that the Catholic Church isn't as people are well aware, it's not a national church, it's an international church. And Catholicism throughout Europe is very worried by these revolutionary forces that are sweeping Europe in the late 18th century. So,
Atheistical republicanism.
yes, and in the era of the French Revolution and what happens to the church in France during that period. So, as the British government is looking to woo the Catholic Church and the Catholic hierarchy are looking to be wooed and are certainly very worried by radical revolutionary movements in this period. So it suits both of them. And to think that, 100 years previously, that the government would be funding a Catholic seminary and a huge Catholic seminary is unthinkable.
And just to interrupt you briefly, Cathal, I mean, the people who call themselves the ultra Protestants. So, and these are not just in the north of Ireland, as one might imagine from 20th century history. They're very powerful in Dublin as well. A guy called Tresham Greggs, I studied once upon a time, is an extremist, really, Protestant cleric who is absolutely against what he sees as concessions to the Antichrist. And he's not shy about saying that, and he can't believe that the Catholic Church gets granted schools, gets granted even a university in the 1840s. This is also a split, interestingly, between Daniel O'Connell and the mostly Protestant Young Irelanders, who are the kind of radicals. But like the Protestant establishment in Ireland is kind of aghast that the Catholic Church gets all these concessions because it's so opposite to the ideology of Protestant ascendancy, which had been the norm. It had been the state ideology, in the 18th century.
Yeah, so we have to remember it's well into the 19th century. It's 1869 before the Church of Ireland is disestablished as the state church in Ireland at a time when, and throughout all of its history, it never rose more than 10 or 11% of the population. Yet, every person in the country, regardless of whether they're a member of the Church of Ireland or not, has to pay a tithe, a special tax to support the Church of Ireland.
Until the 1830s, yeah.
Yeah, and even with which I thought was interesting, reading about the growth of the national school system, which is primary education throughout Ireland, which is state funded and a series of primary schools built throughout the whole of Ireland. The Church of Ireland is absolutely gassed that
Yeah.
secular education, where secular, yes, but like depending on the area,
Mhm.
different religious denominations could come in and have a say in the running of the school or provide religious education. They're appalled that education is not the preserve of the Church of Ireland solely, rather than any
Yeah.
state body.
But I mean, it's not that you'd sympathize with them, but you can see where they're coming from. I mean, it's like this was the state ideology. This was the Protestant kingdom. The king takes an oath to defend the faith. What is this? You know,
Mm.
this this is concessions to papistry, to idolatry, Romanism, and so on. So, Protestants actually very aghast by this, and you do see you always have a liberal Protestant constituency as well. Like 13 of O'Connell's MPs are Protestants, which something people probably don't appreciate. Some of the great landlords of Ireland are liberals as well. Like Parnell is the most famous example. Even very late in the day, as regards Catholic self-mobilization, Parnell, a Protestant landlord, is their leader. But there is a hardening of many Protestants over the course of the 19th century. They're very worried about this losing control and power, the religious concessions. I mean, you see, even in the municipal politics of Dublin, a lot of the Protestant upper class moves out of the city centre to their own townships where they can still have control because they've lost the demographic and the electoral dominance that they had. So in the 19th century, I mean, people probably associate the Union with a type of Protestant ascendancy, but it's more complicated than that.
Yes, like when you think about how closely interwoven church and state are, like we talk about church and state being interlinked in the Republic of Ireland, the Irish Free State,
Yeah.
after 1921, in the 18th to 19th century, up until disestablishment, the church, meaning the Church of Ireland, and the state are completely interlinked. Like the civil parishes, the way that civil society is run, are based on the Church of Ireland parishes. Like the university, Trinity College, is hand in glove with the Church of Ireland. And they're landowners as well. They get large tracts of land during the plantations in Ireland. So this idea that the Church of Ireland is going to be disestablished, you would think it seems perfectly obvious. It seems entirely reasonable. Why should a church that only 10% of the population belong to be the state church, the official church of the country? But the anger and the disappointment that this brings to a lot of Protestants is genuine. It's real.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so there's, on that and things like as Gladstone does this establishment, he also does land acts and stuff. It's a number of things. So you've lost control of the electoral process, you lose control over education, and then the church, many of them still genuinely see the Catholic religion as basically a bad religion. It's a tyrannical religion, it's corrupt and so on. You're giving concessions to it. Tresham Greggs, who was very much an extremist, I mentioned him before, the Dublin preacher of mid-century, says, "What is the British Empire if it's not the empire of truth? How can truth mix with the lie?" So there's a number of things happening. So on the one hand, Protestants gradually are losing their control over Irish society, actually, in the 19th century. But there's also a very strong religious dimension. And I think we should probably close alcohol. But one thing to mention as well is one of the stories of the 19th century, which is a great irony in Irish history, is various Protestant churches for the first time in the 19th century, in the era of emancipation, actually begin to make an effort to convert Irish Catholics to Protestantism. It's the first big drive because there's no incentive to do it in the 18th century. It's contrary actually to your position as a privileged minority. But in the 19th century, actually, there are real conversion wars between the churches in Ireland.
Yes, that could be an entire show all of its own about proselytizing.
Maybe
And
we should do one actually, but just to
yeah,
mention, yeah.
and even trying to proselytize in Irish-speaking areas on the West Coast, place like Achill, all this type of stuff.
I guess let's put it this way. I mean, once competition is open between religions, then once the market becomes free, the competition really increases. And of course, in Irish history, it can't quite be separated, the sectarian side, the religious side, and the communal side or the political side as well.
Yes, and on that note, I think we could talk for another hour, but I think it might be time for bed. It might be time for the listener to log off. Right. You can find this episode and all our previous episodes at irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at irishhistorypod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. It really does help us. And if you hear an episode you like, please share it on your social media. We are very grateful for all the support we receive from you, the listeners. Now, as I mentioned earlier, John has set up a Patreon for the Irish History Show and the Irish Story. And a lot of the topics that we covered here this evening are also, there's a lot of articles about them on the Irish Story, so it's worth a look. And if you consider supporting the show, there is a link in the show notes. And thank you so much to everyone who has contributed already. So on behalf of myself, Carl Brennan, and my co-presenter, John Dorney, thank you very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.